Coming up on Straight Talk, a conversation about leadership, community trust, and the path forward for Multnomah County.
I feel so fortunate that each day I get to walk into court and stand up for victims and fight for the safety of the community.
We sit down with newly elected District Attorney Nathan Vasquez as he steps into one of the most critical roles in our community, from plans to curb violent crime and drug use.
I think that individuals that are endangering people that are trying to get to work, kids that are trying to go to school, they need to be held accountable.
To stepping into a different course set by his predecessor.
If this was something that was so important and so valuable to do, this could have been done years ago.
We'll ask the tough questions about his vision, priorities, and plans to address the challenges ahead, right now on Straight Talk. Multnomah County voters made their voices heard in last year's election, tapping a new leader to oversee order, ensure laws are upheld, and that justice is served. Serving as the chief prosecutor, new Multnomah County DA Nathan Vasquez was sworn into office just weeks ago. In his swearing-in ceremony, he pledged many things, including prioritizing collaboration and working to restore safety and confidence in our community. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Stephanie Domerat. DA Vasquez joins us today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's so great to have you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, first, I want to talk, before we get into your policy and your plans, I want to ask you more of a broader question, really, as you come into this new role. In other major West Coast cities in the U.S., including Los Angeles and San Francisco, voters have recently shown a dissatisfaction with the handling of crime and safety in their communities and elected new district attorneys who tended to be more conservative than their predecessor. You here, during your campaign, we also heard more of a conservative approach. What do you think is going on right now?
Well, I know that here locally in this community, we saw lots of issues with crime, and we saw a community that was ready for a change. You know, people use the term conservative. I don't necessarily see it that way. I look at it as I'm a very practical, pragmatic prosecutor who's done this job for, coming up on 25 years. And, you know, I love this work. I'm dedicated to the community. And I think the community was ready for that change. The idea of let's bring in an individual who's really dedicated to some pragmatic problem solving.
Okay, yeah, definitely seeing that here. And I know you're just getting started, sworn into office January 6th. You've been in office now for a few weeks, and we're already seeing a shift in your stance then, separate from your predecessor. One of those things being the response to illegal protest activity that we saw. On Tuesday night, we saw criminal behavior following a peaceful protest in downtown Portland. Here's what we heard from you.
Whether you are on the left, the right, the center, it does not matter. If you break the law, I'm going to seek to hold you accountable.
So first, why do you feel it is so important to get out ahead of this and respond so differently than what we've seen recently?
Well, again, it comes back to experience of, I've been involved in this work for a long time. I've been working in this space of dealing with kind of what I'm going to call political violence for, over a decade. And it's critical that I want people to feel free to come out and peacefully get their message out. That's important, and that's a huge part of what we're hearing from Portland Police and others. But that message is derailed and our community is damaged when people engage in either violence or vandalism, and it's just something that I have no tolerance for.
Okay. Is there anything different that happens now behind the scenes now that you will be prosecuting these types of crimes that maybe that attention can't go somewhere else in your office?
I don't see it as taking away from what we're currently doing in the office. The different part is that we are so deeply collaborating with local law enforcement, with community, with business leaders. We're looking for every opportunity to partner so that people can have peaceful protests. It is purely looking at those individuals that are seeking to do violence or to damage our community. And what we saw just in this past event, the individuals really were anarchists, for lack of a better term, and they had the literature on them, in the photos. And this is an issue that is very is critical to this community, to my office, is that people can protest and they can be heard, but violence and vandalism is not going to be tolerated.
Something else, huge news this week. Obviously, President Donald Trump sworn into office. On day one of his administration, he signed a flurry of executive orders, including some targeting immigrants, children of people without legal status as well. One included requiring immigrants unlawfully in the U.S. to be registered and fingerprinted. Another leaves the door open to deport migrants who practice free speech. That's critical of the U.S. And then on Wednesday, the Justice Department announced federal prosecutors investigate local officials who they believe are interfering with Trump's crackdown on immigration. This seemingly to target especially sanctuary jurisdictions such as Portland, such as Oregon. So what is your reaction to these latest efforts?
Well, of course, I'm very concerned. You know, yes, there's that issue of could I be prosecuted? You know, and while that, you know, is a concern, I'm more concerned for these families. You know, these are members of our community. In this city, in this community, we have been always very vocal about our support for refugees, migrants, immigrants, and that's not going to change. And while this is a concern, and certainly I'm not going to do anything to obstruct governmental, you know, administration on the federal side, it's important to know that what my concern is that victims and members of our community feel safe, that they feel like they can come and report crimes, that, you know, that they can receive, you know, the services that this community has put forward. And one of the biggest areas that concerns me is, you know, the rise of bias crimes. This is something that my office is dedicated to prosecuting, and we will remain dedicated to that. But it's something I'm going to watch very closely in the coming days and months.
Is there anything specific right now in light of President Trump's orders that your office is doing specifically to protect undocumented people?
Well, there's a few different things. For example, last night I went out and I spoke with community members through the Latino network, and just letting them know that this is a sanctuary city and a sanctuary state, because a lot of folks, I don't think when they come from a different country, they don't necessarily look at the government in different parts. They just see the government. And in reality, you know, the state of Oregon, Multnomah County, we're very different from the federal government. We don't have the same priorities. And my priority is very much to the families and community members here in this community.
I want to ask specifically about the threat to local officials who may be kind of getting in the way of Trump's vision or Trump's orders. Among your peers, you know, how are you guys talking about this? Is this something that we could really see?
Well, it's certainly discussions we're having, you know, in speaking with the Oregon State Attorney General, Dan Rayfield, and then also speaking, you know, with the other district attorneys. You know, we're carefully looking at it. You know, we've already analyzed the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act that I think is the administration has put forward. We don't see it the same way that the federal government does. And so, you know, it's something we're going to carefully monitor and go forward on. We're going to continue to abide by our state sanctuary laws. And, you know, it's certainly, we're going to watch and see how it unfolds, but there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of discussion about kind of what the best course of action is.
And specifically, I wanted to ask you, DA Schmidt did enact an immigration reform policy, right, a few years ago that meant that non-citizens who were accused of relatively minor crimes or nonviolent crimes were not at risk of being deported back to their country of origin. Does that still stand?
Well, the way it works in that particular policy is that that's a factor that can be considered in when we're making decisions about how to resolve a case. And I think it's something that we'll still look at. All the policies from the prior administration are being carefully reviewed. Some of those will change and some will stay.
Okay. At the beginning of the year, Senate Bill 1553 expanded the penalty for drug use on public transit. It's now a Class A misdemeanor, which is punishable up to about a year, $6,000 fine, or both. 2 weeks ago, we saw the first arrest under this new law. The woman was taken into custody, charged under the updated statute for interfering with public transportation, as well as recklessly endangering another person who was on TriMet at the time. The woman was arrested, booked, then released the same day. But then, according to court records, she did not appear in court the next day. What is your role in improving the situation that many call catch and release?
Yeah, it's something that I talked about a lot this past year, and it's something that I'll be working with the Sheriff's Department on as well. I know that Sheriff Morrissey O'Donnell is very concerned about this as well, and in that, you know, there are kind of different points at which an individual comes into the system, and then the question is, are they coming back to those court dates, or should they be released back into the community? And I've worked closely with our criminal presiding court to look at when someone should or shouldn't be released, and so we're taking from my office's perspective, a firm stand on that. And then when it comes to those individuals that are failing to return, it is about looking at all the different ways in which we can make sure that if there is a warrant, that we're able to go ahead and take care of that and get that person back in, because oftentimes if we don't take action and we just let a situation continue, we see it get worse. And that's not what we want for the community, and it's not what we want for victims, and certainly not what we want for that individual that may be struggling with substance abuse disorder.
So you mentioned the sheriff. I want to talk a little more about that in jail capacity. Last October, Sheriff Nicole Morrissey O'Donnell raised concerns of the jail coming close to capacity when it rose above the 90% mark. Once the jail hits 95% capacity, of course, their state law requires that jails start releasing people who are under certain categories, or they stop booking people altogether. So as of Tuesday, I checked, Multnomah County beds were at 92.5 capacity. Granted, this was coming out of a holiday weekend, which they said was a little abnormal, but how do you see your office playing a role as far as working to hold people accountable for these nonviolent crimes with this capacity issue?
Stephanie, this is a great topic. So the sheriff has actually, in my office as well, but the sheriff in particular has been talking about this for several years. This isn't kind of an overnight problem. This has been coming for quite a while. And for people to kind of understand the context of it all, in Multnomah County, we have brick and mortar built around the capacity for around 1,600 jail beds. But then when it comes down to what's actually funded, so in other words, the staff, the facility, the ability to turn the lights on or to run them, it's really about 1,100 beds that are currently being utilized. What happened is that the sheriff had been talking about this, raising this issue, and then it kind of came to a head here recently, and the county did put in some additional dollars to help with hiring staff and that. But there's still this gap, and that gap is approximately 500 beds, and what's happening is we're seeing that the population is starting to bump up against that number, the jail population. So in the coming months, I'll be very plain. I expect that you're going to see people released that really shouldn't be. And my hope is that one, this conversation will continue with the county about funding and about, and I know that the sheriff is working very diligently to increase staffing and do that, but that's only a piece of the puzzle. I mean, the other pieces are, how do we then intentionally staff and fund those jail beds? Because, it's an area that I've put a lot of thought into, and I really believe we can do a better job in that area. And I know the sheriff and I are having conversations about this, and it's around doing things like creating more of what we call treatment readiness dorms. So it's having the ability to, when we're having people that come into custody that are suffering with, whether it's substance abuse disorder, sometimes mental health, it's having the county health department and others kind of involved in that process to get those individuals into the most stable position possible. And for my part, certainly we're looking through our cases and saying, okay, how can we get things resolved quicker, faster, in an appropriate manner, so that we're not having jail beds being used unnecessarily. We want to be as efficient as we can and do that in a manner that can hopefully reduce the stress. But I always like to be very kind of straightforward and say, we're going to see some releases. And
do you see your office continuing to prosecute when you know that some of these people will just end up right back on the street?
I cannot ignore crimes. I cannot ignore victims. We are going to continue to do our job at the district attorney's office. We have a role to play, and we're going to do that. I believe the judges are going to play their role and make the appropriate decisions about when to hold someone, when not to. And the sheriff is going to staff the jail to what she is funded and her ability to, and then it's up to our county commissioners, and of course with our input and decisions of, okay, do we need to increase those jail beds, do we not? And so everyone has their role to play, and I'm certainly going to be playing mine.
Okay, well, I want to talk a little bit, you touched on it a bit, is drug abuse, addiction in our communities. Let's talk about a major program that started last year in 2024, deflection. Multnomah County opened its first deflection center in Southeast Portland in October. For those unfamiliar who are watching, drug deflection is part of the rollback on Measure 110 to recriminalize drug use, but it offers a way for people who are caught using drugs to get treatment instead of jail time. So when sworn into office, we asked you about the program. Here's what you had to say.
As long as that I am seeing that it is getting people meaningfully connected to treatment, yes. Do I think there may be some changes? Perhaps, but the chair and I will discuss that.
So what were some of those changes that you anticipated or that you plan to discuss?
Well, I've seen some positive developments, and I still see some areas that we need to continue to work on. The positive developments are the chair has been working on bringing a sobering and stability center into place, and I think that's a huge gap and need in our community. So I'm happy to see that. When it comes to deflection, though, there is that question of, are people actually engaging in this? And I've always talked about meaningful engagement. And when we look at the numbers, what there's a section of people that, quite frankly, are coming in and just walking out. And that's concerning. The other part is, okay, what happens then once we do the assessments at that deflection center? Are people actually then taking the steps? Because, right now, these aren't like huge burdensome requirements. We're not saying, hey, I need you to do 6 months of treatment. I mean, sometimes it's very basic things. And right now, the numbers are still at a place where I think we really need to look at what changes do we need to make to really get more engagement, because I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
And specifically looking at the numbers, I did want to mention, so 152 people actually, according to Multnomah County data, did choose to initiate deflection, as you mentioned. And we know from our reporting, and as you mentioned, that people don't always stay in treatment for various reasons. So I do want to ask you, though, if people don't stay in treatment and they're arrested again within 30 days, how would you plan to prosecute those people who already had initiated deflection?
Well, it's fairly laid out in the statute. And so what happens is the first court is right after deflection is it's much like diversion. They're going to go in, they're going to have some supervision, but it'll be much more court monitored. And it's a very kind of like phased in approach in that they're going to have that diversion option first, according to the statute, and then after that, we start looking more at your traditional probation and sanctions that way. It's something that, of course, my office is going to look at. When we have these individuals coming back, I'll tell you right now that 1 month turnaround is very tight in that. Yes, officers are having contact with people on a daily basis, but at the same time, with the staffing levels at Portland Police and others, I don't think they're having that opportunity to do that intensive work as much as I'm sure they would like to do. And so, when we do see those individuals, though, we're going to be working with them and doing everything we can to try to really help direct them into treatment.
As opposed to going to jail.
Yes, I mean, the way that the statute's written, you first start to direct people into treatment, you give them multiple opportunities. Jail is a much farther down the road after lots of efforts have been made.
Okay.
And that will be the approach of this office, and it's the approach of the law.
Okay. Thank you so much. Stay with us. When we come back, we will be addressing one of the issues former District Attorney Mike Schmidt called a, quote, urgent threat to public safety. We'll hear from Dave Vasquez his thoughts on the issue and how to address it when we come back. And welcome back to Straight Talk. Thanks for being with us. We are continuing our conversation with the new Multnomah County DA, Nathan Vasquez. Nathan, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
To continue our conversation, we want to talk about the judicial process. Of course, people who are accused of crimes need representation in court, right? So with a public defender, people who are accused of crimes and cannot get an attorney will either sit in jail or basically be released. So it's been widely reported that there is a shortage of public defenders. The load of cases that your predecessor commented to this said that it was an urgent threat to public safety. So in a recent interview with OPB, you referred to this problem as a, quote, defense attorney work stoppage. Yeah. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things I want to take issue with. One is, yes, it's been widely reported that there's a shortage of criminal defense attorneys, but I think if people actually take time to look at the numbers, that's not actually the case. There's more public defenders than there are prosecutors, for example, which I don't think most people would find that surprising to know. And when I talk about this being a work slowdown or work stoppage, what I mean by that is certainly not to criticize the individual line defense attorney. When they are representing their their clients. They are doing it zealously. They are working hard for their clients. The issue is the refusal to take cases. And that is, that to me, and this is where it becomes a really complex, tough issue, is that it's buried in a few different layers. So how we pay for public defenders is through a government agency called OPDC. And so it's a governing body that now is under the governor, and they're responsible for putting out these contracts. But unfortunately, what's happening here in Multnomah County is that we are just seeing thousands of cases that aren't being appointed an attorney. And even the judge can't step in and say, well, you're going to take that case. They're just simply refusing to do it, and it ends there. And what my biggest concern is this: there's a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency in this area. We have repeatedly asked for the numbers, and by that I mean, okay, you have 10 defense attorneys, give us all the numbers of the cases they have so that we can see that are you taking the appropriate amount, because there's a limit that they're supposed to be taking, and what we know so far is that here in Multnomah County that's not being met. There are other types of criminal defense attorneys that they're commonly referred to as a consortium, for example. The consortium attorneys, there's this thing, it's called the MAC currently. It's
the maximum capacity, right?
Maximum allowable caseload,
right.
I think is what it stands for. But and it has a point system, and it's at 300. The consortium attorneys are taking 100% and sometimes over 100% of that. The nonprofit public defense firms are taking much less, like sometimes in the 70% to 80% range. So that's concerning to me.
Okay.
And it's something that I think the community should demand accountability. I know that the state legislature is looking at this, and I know that the governor's concerned about this as well, because at the end of the day, for me, it comes down to victims not being served. It comes down to our community not getting the justice it deserves, and sadly, it often results in many criminal defendants who are in a crisis or having problems, and it just gets worse and worse, and we see them commit additional crimes. And instead of maybe having an opportunity to intervene, we're now in a posture where that person has to go to prison.
I do want to mention I did reach out to the Oregon Judicial Department just this week to ask more about kind of this public defender crisis that we're seeing, the shortage. They said to me, so the Oregon Judicial Department said that they need about 23 more attorneys, all working at 100% of their caseload, to be able across the state to be able to address the backlog of people who are waiting for a lawyer. So I did want to mention that, and again, you mentioned that could be different because of the different organizations that they contract with.
Sure, and when we talk about that too, it's important to know, when you're down in Coos County or in Jackson County or some of the smaller counties that are outlying, yes, there may in fact be a shortage of public defenders in those counties. That is not the case here. And Multnomah County is different. We are much different than a lot of the rest of the state. And I think our problem needs to be looked at and evaluated. Because I'll tell you, I look over just to the south in Clackamas County, they don't have the same crisis. They are fully based on what's called the consortium model that I talked about, and they're not at all anywhere near us as far as unrepresented defendants. Whereas we are kind of off the charts, Clackamas County is not. And so that alone should start to raise some real important questions. Okay,
well, I want to get on. We only have a limited time, so
yes.
I want to move on to a different topic. You spoke about homicides, violent crime a lot in your campaign. We've seen some progress last year. Still, Portland had 68 homicides last year, significantly more than Seattle, which had 51. San Francisco, 35. What is your plan to tackle homicides and gun violence in our community?
It's a few different approaches, because there's never going to be a one solution that's going to fix it all. So certainly it is working closely with community partners. My office is heavily engaged with the community in all different areas of the county, whether it's North Portland, Gresham, in the Hazeldale area. So we work in all of these areas with community partners and look at different ways to interject with issues of violence, such as, is it that young people need mentors? Do we need to do more in our juvenile system? And then the other big way, though, is I'm looking at building out what I call our strategic prosecution unit, and it's one that it uses data and it looks at where there are either problematic areas, problematic individuals, and we then kind of really focus efforts. We've seen that at various times where certain areas of the city have seen a really strong violent upticks, and that's where we need to make sure that we're working closely with Portland Police or Gresham or others to make sure that we address that as soon as we can to head off as much as we can.
Okay. DA Nathan Vasquez, thank you so much for coming in. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I appreciate you today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today here on Straight Talk. Next week, we will be covering the start of the new legislative session, what both sides hope to accomplish in this long session. I will be out of the office, but our Tim Gordon will bring you that show next week. And a reminder, you can stream Straight Talk on your own schedule anytime. You can download the free KGW Plus app available on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. And you can also listen anywhere you get your podcasts. We will see you next time on Straight Talk. And until then, thanks for watching and be well.